Okay, welcome back to the weekly Parsha with Nechama Leibowitz. And on this week's Parsha, which is Parshat Bo. Parshat Bo is a little bit of a darker Parsha, and I think it hits differently in different years, I'm sure. But with all of the plagues of darkness and death, it's just, it's a little bit of an intense Parsha. I wanted to look today at the chapter, the essay from her book about the valuables that the Bnei Israel took. And we'll look at the psukim here. But I think that it's something that I think is one of the pieces of the story that we often touch upon, which is like a little bit of a discomfort that we bring. Bnei Israel leaves Egypt with gold and silver from the Egyptians. And in some years we say like, oh, that's a little bit uncomfortable, right? And in other years, maybe we say, well, we had it coming. I think it's kind of like a litmus test of where we are in some ways in our national story. There is a fascinating midrash that talks about where Bnei Israel got the building supplies for the Mishkan. So we're not at the Mishkan quite yet, but the sort of classical answer is that the Mishkan building supplies came from Egypt. And there's this counter narrative proposed in the Midrash that suggests that Bnei Israel had been saving up in Egypt, that when Yaakov died, he said, one day you will be free and you will be able to worship Hashem and build a Mishkan, and you need to be ready. And I love that Midrash. I think it's beautiful, this idea of like generations saving all of their precious things, even throughout slavery, sort of always keeping that thread of hope, I think is very beautiful. But what I also especially like about it is that I think it shows the rabbi's discomfort at using looted property to build the Mishkan. They want the Mishkan's building supplies to come from some other source. And sometimes they have to dig very deep. There's an idea that the jewels for the Mishkan like fell from the sky, like manna from Hashem. Which again, I think is just the rabbi's hesitation to use the Egyptian rechush, to for this purpose, this sort of holy purpose. And there's something a little bit underhanded about it, right? That as we're leaving, we take advantage of the darkness, perhaps, to get the property. And I really liked the way that Nechama Leibowitz addressed this issue. I thought it was a little bit different than what I was familiar with, and was like a refreshing take. So let me open the source sheet here. My computer is going a little slowly today. Can you guys see it yet? Okay, hold on. It's still thinking. Almost there. Uh-oh, now everyone's frozen. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think I don't know what I have to do with my computer, but hopefully it's an easy fix that I can fix for next week. So she starts by saying, right, that this historic struggle between Moshe, the prophet of God, the Lord, right, on one side, and Paro, the king of Egypt, at the epic-making moment of the release of the children of Israel from bondage to freedom, described in our Sidra. Oh, no. Okay, it looks like I'm going to have to re-sign in a second here. We come across the following passage. Okay, sorry about this. I don't know why this happens every week now. And so we're going to see in just one moment what the pasuk is. Oh gosh, and it always asks me for a password, and I can never remember what it is. Let's try that. Okay, we're going to be back in business. I'm sorry about that. How frustrating. Okay, we're going to have to make it big again, I can tell. So the two psukim come from Perek Yud Bet, And it says that Bnei Israel asu kidvar Moshe. I'm going to make it bigger as soon as I can. It's just thinking about loading here. That the Bnei Israel had done as Moshe had asked. V'yish'alu mimitzrayim kli kasef uchli zahav usmalot. And so what it says here, the translation is, and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing, which is such an interesting word, right? Vayishalu is like they asked of in some way. V'Hashem natan et chen ha'am. Here we go. Be'enei Mitzrayim v'ish ilum v'inatzlu et Mitzrayim. And God had disposed the Egyptians favorably towards the people, and they let them have their request, thus they stripped the Egyptians. So I think it's uncomfortable is maybe the way that I would say it. To sort of figure out what's going on here. What does it mean that they had borrowed things? And what does it mean that God had sort of made the Egyptians be favorable? What does it mean that they stripped the Egyptians of their things? But Nechama Leibowitz puts it in an interesting perspective. She says, had the steel
the deeds, had the deeds.
Thank you. I need to remember to leave my book out here so that I can find my typos. Had the deeds constituted the private initiative of the Israelites, enslaved, exploited, and downtrodden for 2 centuries, accustomed to the taskmaster's blow and the casting of their children into the river, had it been related that they were incapable of taking advantage of the tidings of redemption because of shortness of spirit and hard work, right? Because of ketzaf ruach, that they went and did what they did, the spoiling their oppressors and persecutors, no explanation would have been called for, right? It sounds like on one level, Nechama is saying they would have got what they deserved because of all of the hard work they had done, because they weren't even capable of taking advantage. They were just so downtrodden. They deserved that gold and silver. The Torah describes the generation of the wilderness without any idealization, with all its slave mentality, ingratitude, not ingratitude, lack of faith, and longing for the flesh pots. In this, too, they would have run true to form. But this is not what is related here, right? Meaning she's saying we expect this of the Bnei Israel that we get to know. On the contrary, we are told that the deed they committed was not the fruit of their initiative, but was a response to an explicit divine command transmitted through Moshe. Okay, reparations is a great word, right? Nelson put in the comments, call it reparations. And I want us to start collecting some of those words because I think we do have to figure out exactly what we're thinking of this as. And I think that, yes, reparations, right, sort of the way we think of reparations today, right? Being repaid or paid for work that you had done or trauma you had suffered. And this is sort of like a national thing, right? Like the German government pays reparations to Holocaust survivors. The American government pays, I think, some reparations to
Native.
the African-American population or to indigenous people, right? So that it's like a systemic thing. And I think it's a good word for it. But what Nechama Leibowitz is saying is that this is not actually what is happening here. It's actually a divine command. So we had read, now we're going up back a chapter here, right? This is from Yud Bet and this is from Yud Aleph. Daber na ba'aznei ha'am, right? God is telling Moshe, speak to the people. Vishalu ish me'et re'ehu v'isha me'et ru'uta kli kesef v'chli zahav. Right? So this is God telling Moshe to say what he's going to say. And then in fact, it happens one pasuk later. Now, the translation is striking. So this is the translation in Sefaria, the sort of standard translation. Tell the people to borrow, each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. It's very much in line with the pasuk we just read before. But I brought in the translation that Nechama Leibowitz provided because she references it. And it's a little bit different, I think, than the translation there. Speak now in the ears of the people, a much more reasonable word for word translation of the Hebrew. And let each man ask of his neighbor, and each woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold. Rashi enlightens us regarding the true significance of that one small Hebrew word, appended to the divine expression of common, a word not usually found in the context of orders and precepts, right? He refers to the word na, daber na, an expression of request corresponding to the English please, right? It could have said, please tell the people, or please speak in the ears of the people. But here it is translated by the rather colorless now. Here is Rashi's comment in which he echoes Talmudic exegesis. So daber na, right? He says, Eina ela lashon bakasha. It's always an expression of request, but bakasha mimcha has hirem al kach. Shelo yomar oto tzadik Avraham va'avdum v'inu otam kiyem bahem va'achrei chen yitz'u b'rechush gadol lo kiyem bahem. Okay, so what is going on here? He's saying that in the Brit Ben Habitarim that happened way back in Breshit, when Hashem says, listen, your people are actually going to go into slavery, right? They shall serve them, they shall be afflicted by them in Pasuk Yud Gimel. That has happened, right? That piece of the property has happened, the prophecy has happened. But in the following pasuk in the Brit Ben Habitarim, God says, and after they are enslaved and they are afflicted, Yetzu b'rechush gadol, they'll leave with a big substance, big property, right? And so it seems as though what God is saying is, please tell them, because I have to fulfill both sides of the prophecy. If I'm going to, if I did fulfill the prophecy that you will be enslaved, I have to fulfill my promise to Abraham that you will also leave with a rechush gadol. So I think it's an interesting way of putting this into the context of a much longer story. This is not, another word, a less kind word to Bnei Israel, not reparations, but could be looting, right? Taking advantage of the situation in which it was dark and the Egyptians were not able to see, or when the Egyptians were all suffering the trauma of losing their firstborn children, that Bnei Israel looted them. But in fact, this is all part of God's bigger plan. It's not like the whim of Bnei Israel, and it's not the sort of largesse of the Egyptian government. It is a divine promise. And in fact, she reminds us that this is not the first time God has brought up this topic with Moshe. And it's even more puzzling at the burning bush. We're hearing for the first time the divine call. Moshe was told, so the similar words, right? I will dispose the Egyptians favorably towards you. And you will not leave empty-handed when you go. And again, this word v'sha'ala, right? V'yishalu, the way that it was later in our prakim. V'shala isha mishkanateha mishchanata umigarat beita klei kesef v'chlei zahav usmalot. Right, so similar to the pasuk that we read from Yud Bet, each woman shall borrow from her neighbor and the lodger in her house objects of silver and gold and clothing. V'samtem al b'nechem v'al b'notchem v'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim, and you shall put them on your children and strip the Egyptians. So it seems like this whole of this transaction has been anticipated in the divine message to Abraham at the Brit Ben Habitarim, the covenant between the pieces, right, which foretold the future destiny of a nation that had not yet even come into existence, and the fate of the patriarch seed before a son had even been born to him. At this early stage, the promise of the land and the revelation of the impending exile and redemption was coupled with the forecast that the Israelite nation to be would go forth with great substance. We must therefore regard this transaction not as spontaneous impulsive action of runaway slaves, sorry about that, but the deliberate implementation of a predetermined divine plan, neither unforeseen nor unexpected. So I will say that I found that startling. I had never connected that before, and I think it's such a different experience. If you think about like how you would shoot the movie scene, it feels more calm, less urgent, right? More satisfying in some way, in my opinion. That it's like we finally moved from Pasuk Yud Gimel to Yud Daled or whatever it was, right? We're moving into a better part of the divine prophecy, but Jew baiters, that is Nechama Leibowitz's word, in every age have not been slow to pounce on this and accuse us of robbery and fraud. Their accusations are echoed in the Talmudic discussion of the topic. right? So here is where we might add looting to our list in addition to reparations, right? And the Gemara tells a number of stories about sort of conversations or throwdowns of like wit between the Jewish people and Alexander of Mokdon. And here, right, the Egyptian people come to Alexander and um, it says, "V'Hashem natan et chen ha'am b'nei Mitzrayim v'shilum." Right, the Lord gave the people a favor and they lent them. Tenu lanu kasef esahav. We want it back. You stripped it from us. We want it back. You said you were borrowing it, and yet, right, it's like borrowing a cup of sugar. Like, you don't always expect that back. Borrowing a tissue, right? This was not what we meant. And Gviha ben Psisa said to the Chachamim, "Tenu reshut ve'elech, give me permission, and I will go va'adzun imahem lifnei Alexandros. Let me be the one to go debate with Alexander. If they defeat me, right, he's very, very humble. He says, if they defeat me, then they'll just say, oh, Hediot Shabanu Nitzachtem. You've defeated an ordinary person from us. So there's like no loss, right? If I lose, you'll just say, oh, I wasn't very good. And if I win, you'll say, Torat Moshe Rabbeinu Nitzachtem. Oh, it was the Torah of Moshe, and no significance will be attributed to me. It's hard to know exactly who this guy is and why he would make such a self-effacing argument, but it works. And Natsnu lo reshut. The sages give him permission, and he goes and he deliberates. And he says, from where are you citing this proof, right? Mehechan atem mivi'in ra'aya. Where is this proof from? And they say, min haTorah. And so he says to them, I too can bring a source. Ani lo avi lechem raya ela min haTorah, right? I also will bring a source from the Torah, where it says, "Umoshav bnei Israel asher yeshvu b'Mitzrayim shloshim shana v'arba'a me'od shana." It says that we dwelt in Egypt for 430 years, most of which we were enslaved. Tnu lanu sachar avodah, right? As Nelson said, reparations. We worked for 430 years. I think, we probably deserve more than the gold and silver we took, right? And he says the wages of work for 600,000 men who you enslaved for 430 years. And Alexander turns to the Egyptians. He says, okay, what you got? And they say, give us time to consider. This is sort of a pattern of this series of stories in this part of the Gemara. They give them the time, and velo matzu tshuva. They have nothing to say. Right? So this is an interesting story. We're accused of being looters or thieves, or at worst, of pretending to borrow something we never intended to return. And our mouthpiece, Gevia ben Pestisisa, he says, well, it wasn't really looting because we were owed it. It belonged to us. The inference is obvious, Nechama says. The Egyptians who came to indict us in front of Alexander the Great were none other than the Alexandrians, whose literature is full of anti-Semitic diatribe, alleging that the Jews were a nation of thieves and scoundrels from their very beginnings. Our retort is equally obvious, though its legal and moral basis may be disputable. But were the credit and debit sides respecting our relations with them to be drawn up on a balance sheet, there would still be a deal outstanding to us. So that's one argument, right? The reparations versus looting argument. Philo, in his book, The Life of Moses, shares this approach too. Philo is a very early Jewish scholar, first century. He's in our commentary bios, but I don't want to make us sick or risk upsetting my Google Doc here to scroll down to him, but that's his story. The Israelites were prompted not by love of gain, but merely by the desire to recoup some of the wages due to them, right? So I think that's another thing. It's not that they're going out draped in gold and silver because they're like being flashy or they cared about the material wealth, but that they're just taking what they were owed. Okay. And Philo adds, of course, nothing could really compensate for their loss of freedom and subjugation, right? Most people would prefer not to get reparations and not to have been oppressed in the first place. The apologetic note is also struck in Josephus' Antiquities. The Egyptians honored them with these gifts in order to hasten their departure, and others out of good neighborliness and the friendship they bore them. When they went forth, the Egyptians wept and suffered remorse for the way they had treated them ill. So someone was just sharing this with me today. This idea, she didn't quote Josephus, it's also found in the Mechilta. There's an idea that they are actually gifts, that the Egyptians seem to feel sudden remorse that they had oppressed the Jewish people for so long. And there's some kind of good neighborliness and friendship that they bore them. I think it's fascinating. To me, that feels like such a whitewashing of what had happened for the last 400 years. But Josephus does, I thought what she said here was so interesting. Josephus frequently echoes contemporary rabbinic tradition. That was not something I knew about him, right? Josephus is also a very early scholar, writing sort of from the inside and the outside. And it seems that often he falls in line with his contemporaries in the Midrash. Um, and here, Rabbi Yishmael says, before they could make their request, the offer was forthcoming. Lo hispiku lomar hashileni ad shehu noten lo. And so it's hard to imagine, right? Like a Jew walks up to an Egyptian's house and says, "Can I have this?" It sounds like on some level, and it's unclear exactly what the Egyptians' tone inflection is they're saying, "Here you go." Right. So is it they're saying, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe how far this went. We never meant for it to get out of control. Please take this gold and silver." Or is it like, "Please take it. We've had enough plagues. We don't want any more plagues written on our house. Please just go." Right? Whatever it is, it seems to be seen as a gift, whether it is to make them feel better about the way they treated the Jewish people or to try to avoid future plagues. Gift is another word we can add to our list here. And she goes on, the first commentator to dwell on the exact connotation of the verb sha'al in this context was Sadia, insisting it referred to asking for an outright gift rather than borrowing. He based himself on the usage in Shmuel Aleph. So she's going to mention it here in the text from Ibn Janach. But the verse from Shmuel Aleph says, he is lent to the Lord, right? That Hannah, when she wants a child so badly, she says, I will give Shmuel to you, God. And that she's not really borrowing, right? She's not really saying that God has to return Shmuel later, right? Shmuel is a gift to God. And she never is she had freely willed him, right? That God had never said, if you want a child, you have to give him to me as a loan. She thought of this idea on her own. She had freely willed him as a gift. It's an interesting proof text. There are many more proof texts here from Bachya on the Torah as well. That there are, it doesn't seem like the word she'elah is really used as a loan. It's usually meant to be a gift. It's like a pretty technical point here. And the Rashbam, she's going to take us through another series of psukim where the word shoel means different things. So I think right here, I want to draw our attention right here. We have shoel me'et and shoel me and shoel me'im. And she says, just as in English, when you add a preposition to the verb, it means different things. So this was an interesting one. Ask up, she feels like means to invite. I don't know if that's like an older way of using those two words together. I had never heard of that. But ask of, right, to demand. To ask for something is to request. And to ask about is to inquire, right? So the word ask can mean lots of different things. So too in Hebrew, me'im, me'et, and me you have a different context to them. And she brings, and the Rashbam will bring several cases, right, where if a man could borrow something, yish'al me'im of his neighbor, or let every man of his let them ask every man of his and every woman of her neighbor. That's our pasuk. In none of these cases is the prepositional phrase me'im employed, which is evidently confided to ask in the sense of borrow, right? So the Rashbam is saying that this is definitely an outright gift, right? B'matana gemura. And that God gave chen, natati et chen ha'am, God disposed the people towards Bnei Israel so that they would not refuse these gifts, these requests. And so it seems like what he's saying is that the Jews go and they say, "Could I please have a gift for the road?" And God made the Egyptians say, "Yes, sure." The Chizkuni likewise understands the word sha'al in terms of asking and giving of a gift and not borrowing and lending. But he adds further grounds for assuming so. Here is an interesting comparison that the Chizkuni is going to give, and you can tell me what word we'll add to the list for this one. I'm not entirely sure. But he notes that there's a similarity in words, lo techu rekam, that you shouldn't go empty-handed, with a similar construction when a Jewish slave has ended his term of service, that you have to let him go out not empty-handed. And so the Chizkuni sees a parallel between the Egyptians letting the Jews go after a period of enslavement to a Jewish owner of a Jewish slave sending their Jewish slave away, right? So when someone is enslaved to you because they can't pay their debt, they work for some set number of years and then you let them go. But you don't just send them out with $20 in their pocket or whatever happens in this country. You have to send them parting gifts, livestock, grain, grapes, or wine. It's much more. So I don't know that I would call when we come to this, I don't know that I would necessarily call it um um reparations, because in the Jewish frame, the slavery is deserved, right? Like you're paying back a debt. It's almost like thanks for good service, like a tip, like you didn't I didn't owe you any more, but I want to give you more because it's not right to let you go empty-handed. A little bit less like you're owed it and more some like goodwill, maybe is how I would put it. But what she notes here is that the Chizkuni touches on a problem involved in any mass movement of population, a problem that preoccupied Herzl too in his book The Jewish State, in which he envisaged the mass exodus of Jews from Europe. What would happen to the property and goods of the immigrants to Palestine? This loss of possession has been a blight that has dogged Jews throughout their expulsions from Spain in 1942 to Iraq in the first years of the State of Israel. But in all of these cases, their neighbors were not so kind as to let them have silver and gold articles in return for the wealth they had left behind, and not even on loan at that. This is an interesting read here, I think, right? Which is that oftentimes our possessions were taken from us. We couldn't take things when we traveled, certainly when we were being expelled from places. And so it's almost like being paid for the things we had to leave behind, right? We know that lots of art, beautiful, famous artwork and treasures have been recouped from the Jews of Germany, and sort of figuring out how to get them back to their rightful owners was a very big process. So that's one piece of it. And then the other thing, as I said, is that, right, she articulates that the Chizkuni, who takes our text to refer to a free gift and not a loan, introduces another idea, the parallel with the Hebrew servant between the latter's release from his years of service and the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. Both were entitled to a farewell gratuity or endowment of, I'm sorry, three kinds is obviously not right. Judith, are you still following along in the text? Of these kinds is probably what it is. The parallel is certainly not coincidental, bearing in mind the almost identical wording and the recurrence of such a rare word as rekam. But the Chizkuni leaves the matter there and does not attempt to explain the significance of the comparison, which we shall yet go into. Okay, so far, right, we have possibly gifts, possibly some kind of farewell gratuity, possibly reparations, possibly looting. The Midrash Chamdat Hayamim, which despite his name Midrash is not a Midrash, I had to track him down. Hold on. He feels important to mention here, although I always encourage people to look at the commentary boxes. He is Rabbi Shalom Shabazi. He lived from 1619 to 1720. And the Midrash Chamdat Yamim is a homiletical commentary on the Torah. I don't know. Sorry, that word is hanging out. It's a philosophical, mystical, and exegetical work. He was a poet and a mikubal from Taiman, and he wrote many poems in addition to this work. So I thought he was worth looking up there. Okay, so the Chamdat Hayamim, right, what does he say? Each woman shall ask her neighbor, why was this instruction given to the women? Pharaoh had decreed that every newborn male be thrown into the Nile. The daughters of Israel bribed Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptians with their jewelry to look the other way. The result was that they drowned some of them and let others survive. This is why the text does not record that they threw every child. So this is a fascinating idea that also I had never heard before, that it wasn't just that they hid some of the babies, but that they bribed the officials, right? The woman had the baby, and when the Pharaoh's guards rushed to the door, the woman didn't say, "Oh, he died," which is the midrash, I think, right? The women said, here's a necklace. Can you look the other way? The Holy One, blessed be He, therefore gave instructions that every woman shall ask her neighbor back for what had been taken in bribes. No deception was involved, only restitution. So that's also interesting, right? I kind of feel like if you bribe someone and they do the thing you wanted, you actually don't deserve the thing back. You paid for a service and you got it, right? But it seems like somehow that is restitution of property. It also means, by the way, that the gold is not Egyptian. It's actually Jewish gold that had just traded hands in some like of the more sordid details of slavery. Okay,
Yeah,
we're almost.
Rabbanit,
Yeah, please,
Rabbanit
Sherry.
Yael. I'm thinking that the reason why it's called restitution in that context is that sure you're bribing somebody, and they end up doing what you want them to do, so you really don't deserve to get the necklace back. However, what they were asked to do was so totally unfair that they're calling it restitution for such a cruel edict.
Okay, that's beautiful. I like that, right? So they shouldn't have ever been asked to do it in the first place because no one should ever have to pay for the life of their children to be spared, their babies. And so that's why it's restitution. And that's why specifically it's for the women, because it refers to this gold and silver the women had to give up to save the lives of all these babies.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So restitution, not for slavery in general, but for this very specific infant genocide that was being enacted. Okay. Beautiful. I like it. All of our citations and explanations, however, have not yet answered the question posed at the beginning. What prompted the Almighty to command us to conduct ourselves in this manner and ask favors of mortal men? If God had merely wanted to make amends for Israel and their suffering and raise their morale, had God no other way of doing it? And so I think that like this is what I love about these essays, right? It's like we've just gotten into the weeds of like the grammar and all of these different ideas of how we should frame this wealth. And now we're pulling way back into like the bird's eye view to say what was the point of all of this? Because remember, this was not a spur of the moment thing. This was long ordained from God. So she cites two answers. One is Beno Jacob, who we've seen before, and one is Kasuto, one of actually my favorite Mefarshim. So Beno Jacob says, for an Israelite, the word Egyptian had the bitterest associations. It would not have been remarkable had the Jew hated the Egyptian as the enslaver of his ancestors, and would have reserved the right not to accord him the generous treatment enjoined by the Torah with regard to the stranger. But the Torah records that the Egyptians and Jews parted as friends, the former liberally furnishing them with gifts, as the latter themselves had been bidden in the case of sending away their own Hebrew servants. Servants, right? Consequently, thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian, for thou wert a stranger in his land. But since the Egyptians could not be expected to offer gifts of their own initiative, Israel was bidden to spur them to do it and say to them, let us part as friends, and we'll take with us a parting gift. I don't know how this one sits with you guys. I have to say, I really don't like it. All I could think of in this moment was those little goodie bags that Hamas gave the women 2 weeks ago, those like brown bags with their insignia, right? Like a gift from the Egyptians. And like we were supposed to part as friends after 400 years of slavery. It felt like some kind of weird media stunt. Like I don't understand it. Beno Jacob does not sit well with me. However, I think that Kasuto manages to frame it in a slightly different way that to me makes it a little bit better. So I want to look at both of them and then we can talk about which one we like better. Kasuto similarly cites the parallel between the Hebrew servants' release and that of the Israelites from their Egyptian masters, adding the Hebrew slaves had worked for their masters for the number of years preordained by providence. they were entitled to their freedom and therefore at the same time to the statutory farewell gratuity. The law of rather absolute justice demanded it. Though the latter does not exist in the world, the court on high sees its implementation, directing the course of events accordingly. Right? So it seems as though, Kasuto is saying, listen, they deserved it. The Egyptians were not going to give it to them. And so God sort of had to like put his hands on the scale, right? Kasuto explains the parallel in terms of the divine concern for justice. Now, here is the one place I don't really see this in Beno Jacob's writing, but I think that this is a beautiful idea from Nechama Leibowitz. And I'm sure that she understands Beno Jacob much better than I do. Right, Beno Jacob discovered here an educational device to diminish rancor and weaken feelings of vengeance, to help us fulfill God's bidding that we shouldn't abhor the Egyptian because we were a stranger in his lands. And I think that this is, I didn't understand this in the Beno Jacob text itself, that we have this command not to hate the Egyptian, right? It's from Devarim, Perek Kaf Gimel, and it's hard to imagine how we could grapple with such a command to not hate the Egyptian because it's so deeply embedded in us, right? Like it'd be like saying not to hate the Nazi, right? And so in some way, God was trying to help us overcome the feelings of sort of complete bitterness by offering us these gifts, by trying to like at least change that last note, making it a little bit less sour, so that as we leave Egypt, we can find a little bit in our hearts to not abhor, right? I didn't look up the pasuk in Hebrew, but to not abhor the Egyptian. And I think that that is a really interesting thing that she's saying here. And again, that's the end. She is the master of like the mic drop, right? Like this is such a big sentence and we're not going to get anything else on the subject from her. But I think that this idea that when we leave Egypt, we should not be so completely bitter. We shouldn't have lost ourselves so much in our enslavement that we can't find at least a little bit in our hearts to not abhor the Egyptian. And so this is a tool to help us do that. And I think that, right, what I said so forcefully reminded me of those Hamas goodie bags, which it does. I also think, right, how do we make it so that we have not lost our humanity in such a terrible experience? And that in some way, this little gratuity or reparation or gift or restitution maybe can help us make some little bit of sense out of the whole thing. So I don't know. I don't see that in his work, but I think it's an interesting idea. Educational device, right? Sort of emotional tool as opposed to restitution, reparation, gifts. That could be very powerful. But I still think it's hard, right? It's a hard thing to work out, and we can see it bothered the Alexandrites, and it bothers people throughout history. So I appreciated her sort of forthright way of talking about it, and that she too was grappling with it, right? There was a sentence somewhere where she said, like, as it resonates today, and I thought, wow. Like I couldn't imagine that day for her at that moment, but I felt it too. I think it was right before. I'm not sure. I lost it. But I welcome other people's thoughts. I'll stop the share so we can see each other's faces better. I've either answered every possible question or bored everyone.
Hmm.
Well, I hope I've given everyone something to think about this weekend on Shabbat, and that we have good news, Besorot Tovot, over the next few days. And that I'm trying to think, I think there's something coming up. This coming a week from Thursday, Rabbi Yisachar Katz is coming. He's doing a Beit Midrash session at 8 p.m. It's in person at Skokie Valley, but if you're able to get there, I highly recommend it. He's an excellent teacher. He taught my husband, he taught Ravari. I've learned sort of in one-off environments with him. Really, really unique and interesting person and a master Gemara teacher. And he'll be doing a Beit Midrash at 8:30, and then he's staying through Shabbat for a scholar in residence. So that's not this week, but the following week. And our spring Beit Midrash sessions are coming up starting on President's Day weekend, which I will be in town for. So I will finally get to teach one of the Beit Midrash sessions. The first one on Sunday, the 16th of February, and then every Sunday. So please definitely sign up for that if you are interested. And otherwise, I'll see you next Tuesday for Parsha B'Shalach.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Well, see you soon.
Thank you.